Long before the city of Rome existed, before its walls stood firm and its legions marched across continents, the land was quiet. Soft hills rolled through the center of the Italian peninsula, where forests met fields and rivers carved slow paths through fertile plains. The Tiber River flowed gently through this region, not yet guarded by bridges or ports, its banks lined with reeds and the occasional trail from passing deer. This place, known in time as Latium, was home to scattered peoples, shepherds, farmers, and early settlers who lived in humble huts of straw and wood. They moved with the rhythm of the land, planting where soil was kind, fishing where streams ran deep, and warming themselves by fires long before any city lights broke the horizon. The early history of Rome, like much in antiquity, blends fact with myth. Historians and poets alike have passed down tales that are difficult to separate from legend, and yet they hold truth in their telling. To understand the birth of Rome is to begin with a story, one carried through centuries in soft voices and quiet scrolls. It begins not with buildings, but with a lineage. The tale of Rome's founding traces back to a city far older, Troy. After the great walls of Troy fell to Greek fire and cunning, it is said that a hero named Aeneas escaped. Carrying his aged father on his back and leading his young son by the hand, he fled across the sea. For years he wandered, through storms, across shores, guided by omens and dreams. Eventually, Aeneas reached the western lands, Italy. There, after hardship and conflict, he settled. His descendants would grow in number and strength, giving rise to kings and villages. Among these descendants, generations later, would be born twin brothers whose names are known even now, Romulus and Remus, born to a Vestal virgin and the god Mars, or so the legend claims. The twins were cast into the river at birth by a jealous king, fearful of their bloodline. But the river did not take them. They were found, according to story, by a she-wolf who suckled them in a cave beneath the Palatine Hill. A shepherd would later raise them as his own. Over time, the boys grew into strong young men, unaware of their royal blood. When they learned of their origin, they overthrew the king who had tried to erase them. Then, looking for a place to begin anew, they returned to the banks of the Tiber. It was here, amid 7 hills, that the idea of Rome first stirred. They did not agree on which hill to build upon. Romulus favoured the Palatine, Remus the Aventine. A quarrel followed, not just of geography, but of fate. And in the end, as the story solemnly tells, Romulus killed Remus. Whether this happened in fact or only in tale, the meaning was clear. One would remain, and the city would bear his name. Rome. Founded, as tradition holds, on the 21st day of April, in the year 753 BCE, Romulus marked the city's boundaries with a plough, drawing a sacred line that would grow into walls, forums, temples, and roads stretching to the edges of the known world. But in the beginning, it was only a few huts, a river, and a dream. And that is where we will begin our slow, quiet journey, in the space between myth and memory, where a city still lived in the minds of its founders, and the stones had yet to be laid. The city of Rome, as it came to be known, was born in a place of natural beauty and quiet advantage. At the heart of central Italy, nestled along the gentle curve of the Tiber River, rose a series of hills, not steep mountains or dramatic cliffs, but soft, rounded elevations that offered shelter, visibility, and a sense of presence on the landscape. There were 7 of them: the Palatine, the Aventine, the Capitoline, the Quirinal, the Viminal, the Esquiline, and the Caelian. Though these hills would one day be swallowed into the sprawl of a great city, In the earliest times, they stood apart, each one dotted with small clusters of huts made of mud, straw, and timber. Shepherds and farmers lived upon them, people who tended goats and sowed barley, who warmed themselves by open hearths and drew water from nearby springs. Among these hills, the Palatine stood out, not tallest, but central. It was here, according to legend, that Romulus chose to make his mark. The decision may not have been guided only by myth. The Palatine offered a strong defensive position, natural elevation above the river, and a view across the floodplain. To the north, the Tiber curled like a silver ribbon. To the south, fertile land stretched toward the Alban Hills. From this one hill, a small settlement could command sight of the surrounding territory, a critical advantage in a time when survival meant watching the horizon. The river itself was more than a landmark. It gave life. The Tiber provided fresh water, fish, and a natural pathway for travel and trade. In a time when roads were little more than trampled earth, rivers served as the original highways. Traders and travelers could float downstream toward the sea, or upriver into the interior lands of Etruria and Latium. The river also brought danger. Its waters could flood with the spring rains, and its currents could turn violent after storms. But even in its unpredictability, the Tiber was a gift, a flowing thread that tied Rome to the world beyond its hills. Long before stone bridges crossed it, people would ford the Tiber at its shallow points. Logs might be lashed together to float goods. Rafts carried salt from the sea, timber from the uplands, and sometimes people, visitors, refugees, wanderers. From this movement, ideas flowed as well. Rome would eventually become a city of many languages, customs, and beliefs. But even in its infancy, the land around the Tiber was a place of mingling. The early settlers built with what they had. Huts were circular or oval, formed from wattle and daub walls with thatched roofs. The hearth was the center of the home, both practically and spiritually. Clay pots held water and grain. Animal hides served as bedding. Life was not easy, but it was steady. Fields were planted in the surrounding valleys, and livestock grazed on the slopes. The rising sun cast long shadows across the hills, and as evening fell, smoke from cooking fires drifted into the pink-tinged sky. It is difficult to imagine now. The bustle of modern Rome makes such quiet hard to picture. But in those early days, the city was not much more than a village with a vision. Its hills were not yet crowded with marble temples or imperial palaces. The Forum had not been laid. The Colosseum would not rise for centuries. But the shape of the city, its natural bones, were already in place. The Palatine, where Romulus drew his lines. The Aventine, where Remus once stood. The Tiber, winding quietly below them both. And the 7 hills, rising gently above the plain, waiting for the city to come. In the traditional telling, Rome began with a boundary. Not a building, not a wall, but a furrow cut into the soil by Romulus himself. Holding a wooden-handled plough drawn by an ox and a cow, he traced a sacred line along the ridge of the Palatine Hill, marking the limits of the new city. This act was not just practical, but spiritual. In Roman culture, the founding of a city was a rite, the land made sacred by the drawing of the pomerium, the ritual boundary that defined not only the space of the city, but its identity. As he dragged the blade through the earth, Romulus left deliberate gaps in the furrow, symbolizing entry points, places where gates would one day stand. When Remus mockingly stepped over the line, tradition says Romulus struck him down in a rage. The tale is tragic, But the symbolism was clear. The city was sacred. To cross its boundary uninvited was not merely an insult, but a threat. With the line drawn and the act of foundation complete, the first structures soon followed. These were not the grand buildings of later centuries, but simple huts made of mud and straw. They were built in the same style as the older Latin settlements, round or oval in shape, thatched with bundles of dried grass or reeds, and reinforced with wooden posts driven into the ground. Their interiors were modest: a central hearth, a few storage pots, sleeping mats made from animal skins or woven reeds. These early dwellings dotted the Palatine Hill, clustered close for protection and warmth. The first Romans, if we may call them that, were shepherds, farmers, and exiles. According to the myth, Romulus opened the city to all who would come. Refugees, wanderers, fugitives, and dispossessed men were welcomed. A practical choice for a city that needed hands to build and arms to defend it. This openness would remain a defining trait of Rome, even as it grew. A place where many origins could converge into one identity. But a city needs more than shelters. It needs order. Romulus, so the early historians say, divided the population into wards and tribes. He selected a body of 100 elders, known as the patres, to serve as advisors, the seed of what would later become the Roman Senate. These men represented the oldest families, the first clans to take root in the city. Their authority was informal at first, drawn from age and experience, but it would grow. The city's population grew rapidly. Newcomers brought not only numbers, but skills: metalworkers, potters, carpenters. Trade soon began with neighbouring villages, especially the wealthy and more developed Etruscan towns to the north. These contacts influenced Roman customs, architecture, and religion. From the Etruscans came the practice of interpreting omens through the flight of birds, the use of the curved lituus staff by augurs, and perhaps even the idea of building temples aligned to sacred directions. Rome's first streets were not paved. They were paths worn into the ground by repetition, marked by the hooves of oxen and the footprints of bare feet. The forum, the central marketplace and gathering space, began as a natural low point between hills, a place where water collected in winter and dried in summer. Over time, it was drained, levelled, and gradually transformed into a meeting space. Here, goods were exchanged, news was shared, and deals were struck. The earliest assemblies likely gathered here too, men standing in rough circles, voices raised, decisions made under open sky. Religion played a central role from the start. The Romans believed deeply in the favour of the gods and in the power of rituals to ensure success and protection. Small shrines were erected, often made of wood or stone, where offerings of grain, wine, or incense were given to household gods, to Jupiter the Sky Father, and to Mars, the god of war, and, as the Romans believed, the father of Romulus and Remus. It's worth noting that while the myth gives Romulus credit for founding Rome, archaeological evidence shows that the Palatine and surrounding hills were inhabited for centuries before. But sometime in the mid-8th century, BCE, these scattered settlements began to unify. Defensive ditches were dug, shared gathering places emerged, a sense of shared identity began to form. Whether or not there was a man named Romulus who ruled as king, there was undeniably a moment when these clustered hilltop communities became something more. A city, still small, still rough, but distinct, intentional, and growing. The first foundations of Rome were not of stone, but of soil, sweat, and story. From furrows in the ground and flickering hearth fires, the future was beginning to take shape. After the mythical founding by Romulus, Rome entered its earliest political phase, the time of the kings. This era, known as the regal period, is remembered less through precise records and more through stories passed down by later Roman historians. Much of what is known blends legend with fragments of truth, shaped by generations who look back with both pride and caution. Romulus, the first king, ruled not as a tyrant, but as a war leader and city builder. Under his guidance, the city's defenses were strengthened, neighboring tribes were confronted, and the young population began to organize itself into a society that reflected both hierarchy and collaboration. Though his reign ended in mystery, some said he vanished in a storm and was taken up to the heavens, his name endured. Rome, they said, was his legacy. After Romulus, the crown passed to Numa Pompilius, a figure remembered for very different reasons. Where Romulus was tied to war and expansion, Numa symbolized peace and order. According to tradition, he was a Sabine by birth, a member of a neighboring people, and brought with him wisdom, piety, and a love of learning. Under his rule, Rome turned inward. Temples were built, calendars reformed, and priesthoods established. It was Numa who, according to law, instituted many of the religious offices that would define Roman public life for centuries: the flamines, the augurs, the Vestal Virgins. Numa's Rome was not a city of conquest, but of rhythm, with rituals to mark the seasons, rites to honor the gods, and festivals to connect the community. The sacred fire of Vesta was said to have burned without interruption since his reign, tended by virgin priestesses sworn to chastity and ceremony. It was a time of stability, if not prosperity. And though it may be idealized in hindsight, it marked a turning point, a city gaining shape, not just through power, but through belief. Following Numa came Tullus Hostilius, a return to the martial spirit. Tradition remembers him as aggressive, restless, and ambitious. He expanded Rome's influence through warfare, most notably against Alba Longa, a nearby city considered a relative of Rome through its Trojan roots. The story goes that instead of full battle, the two cities agreed to settle the conflict through a duel of champions: the Hieraci from Rome and the Curiati from Alba Longa. The tale ends with Roman victory, though not without loss, as the last surviving Horatius returned home in mourning and triumph. Tullus Hostilius expanded Rome's boundaries, fortified its defenses, and brought more people under Roman influence. Yet his reign ended ominously. Ancient sources claim he neglected the gods, and when he finally attempted to correct this, he performed the rites incorrectly. Lightning struck his palace. Fire consumed it. His death, like much of early Rome's history, sits somewhere between myth and metaphor. The fourth king, Ancus Marcius, is often seen as a blend of the rulers before him. He waged war when necessary, but also turned his attention to civic development. Under his rule, the first bridge over the Tiber, the Pons Sublicius, was said to be built, connecting the hills to the Janiculum across the river. He also fortified the port of Ostia, giving Rome access to the sea and to salt, a vital resource. Ancus symbolized balance, a leader who knew when to build and when to fight. As Rome grew, so too did its complexity. The early monarchy was not an absolute rule in the modern sense. Kings governed, but they were advised by the Senate, a body of elders who, though appointed, carried the weight of experience and tradition. The people, too, had a voice, gathering in assemblies to witness decisions and elect new kings, even if the actual power remained concentrated in a few hands. These early kings, half historical, half legendary, gave the city its first laws, its first boundaries, and its first sense of identity. Though each ruled differently, they contributed to the evolving shape of Rome, a place that was no longer merely a cluster of huts, but a true city-state, connected to both its mythic past and its expanding future. This period laid foundations that would outlast any one reign. From its rituals and institutions to its roads and walls, Rome was becoming something larger than its founders could have imagined. And still, its most pivotal transformation was yet to come. As Rome entered the later stages of its regal period, a new influence began to shape its culture, politics, and design: the Etruscans. This neighboring civilization, centered in the region just north of Rome known as Etruria, was older, wealthier, and more developed in both art and urban organization. While earlier kings of Rome were either Latin or Sabine in origin, the final monarchs came from Etruscan backgrounds, bringing with them customs and innovations that would leave lasting marks on Roman identity. The Etruscans were a people of mystery, even to the Romans. Their language was distinct, not Indo-European, and though some inscriptions survive, it has never been fully deciphered. They built prosperous city-states like Veii, Tarquinia, and Clusium, each fortified and governed by elites who held religious and political power. Their society was hierarchical and ceremonial, placing strong emphasis on divination, public display, and visual splendor. Rome, still rough-edged and practical in its early form, absorbed much from these neighbors. The fifth king of Rome, Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, known as Tarquin the Elder, is said to have come from Etruria. His ascent to power reflects Rome's openness to outsiders with talent and ambition. Though not Roman by birth, Tarquin married into Roman society and won favor through his wisdom and leadership. Once king, he began a program of urban transformation that reshaped Rome's appearance and administration. Under Tarquin the Elder, the first great public works projects began. The Cloaca Maxima, Rome's vast underground drainage system, was initiated to clear the marshland between the hills, the same low ground that would become the Forum. This feat of engineering turned a swamp into the city's civic heart. Temples were planned, streets were organized. The foundations of what would become the Capitoline Hills' Great Temple District were laid. The Etruscans also brought their fascination with symbols of power. The fasces, a bundle of rods bound around an axe, symbolized the authority of the magistrates. This emblem would remain central to Roman political imagery long after the monarchy ended. The curved ivory seat of office, the sella curulis, and the robe trimmed in purple, the toga praetexta, were also Etruscan in origin, adopted into Rome's visual language of rule. The sixth king, Servius Tullius, is remembered as a reformer and organizer. Though his origins are debated, some say he was born a slave, others say he was of noble birth, his reign was transformative. He reorganized the Roman population not just by bloodlines or tribes, but by wealth and military obligation. This was the beginning of the centuriate assembly, where citizens were grouped into centuries based on property, each with voting power. Wealthier citizens, able to afford arms, had more influence, a system that blended military readiness with political privilege. Servius also expanded the city's physical boundaries, enclosing the 7 hills with a defensive wall that would define Rome for generations. The Servian Wall, named for him, marked a new phase. No longer a collection of separate hilltop villages, Rome was now a single, unified urban space, with a perimeter to defend and a civic identity to protect. But perhaps the most infamous king came last. Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, or Tarquin the Proud. Also Etruscan in origin, his reign was marked by ambition, harshness, and suspicion. He ruled without consulting the Senate, executed rivals, and relied on fear to control the populace. Yet even under his tyranny, Rome continued to grow. Temples were completed. The Temple of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill, one of the most important in Roman religion, was finished under his rule, a towering symbol of Roman power and devotion. Still, the Roman people had grown weary of kings. When a scandal involving Tarquin's family led to widespread outrage, the details passed down through history in whispers of cruelty and dishonor, the people acted. The monarchy was overthrown. Tarquin was exiled. And with his departure, the Roman kingdom ended. But the Etruscan legacy did not vanish. The Romans would carry forward their influence in architecture, religion, public ritual, and urban planning. Arches, domes, and drainage systems, priesthoods and omens, symbols of office and layers of ceremony. The Romans adapted, refined, and claimed it all as their own. Thus, as the curtain closed on the era of kings, Rome stood at a new threshold, shaped by native roots, enriched by foreign influence, and ready to enter the next chapter of its long and quiet march through history. The Roman monarchy, by the end of the 6th century BCE, had become both powerful and brittle. For generations, kings had ruled over the growing city, some remembered as wise and just, others as ambitious builders or ruthless warriors. But like many institutions in history, it was not the strength of the monarchy that undid it, but its excess, and at the heart of that unraveling stood Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud. He ruled as Rome's 7th and final king. Tarquin did not inherit the throne peacefully. Ancient sources tell of bloodshed, a calculated rise to power marked by the assassination of his predecessor, Servius Tullius. Where Servius had governed with consultation and reform, Tarquin ruled with severity. He ignored the Senate, silenced critics, and surrounded himself with loyalists. His reign was marked by grand public works, including the completion of the massive temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill. But his grip on power was maintained not by the will of the people, but through fear. Still, Rome prospered outwardly. The streets grew busier, the forum became more defined, the city's defenses expanded, but within, resentment grew. Tarquin's arrogance, from which he earned the title Superbus, alienated the aristocracy and created tension with the common citizens. His rule began to feel less like leadership and more like domination. The moment that triggered the fall of the monarchy, however, was not political, but personal. According to the traditional account, Tarquin's son, Sextus Tarquinius, committed a grave act against a noblewoman named Lucretia, an assault that shocked the Roman people and ignited long-simmering anger. Lucretia, shamed and heartbroken, revealed what had happened and then took her own life, calling for justice in her final words. Her death became a symbol, not just of personal tragedy, but of everything that had gone wrong under the rule of kings. The reaction was immediate and widespread. A leading Roman noble named Lucius Junius Brutus, said to be a relative of Lucretia's, stepped forward. With fiery words and solemn pledges, he rallied the Senate and the people, demanding an end to the monarchy and the exile of Tarquin and his family. The people agreed. The king, sensing the shift in power, fled into exile, retreating to the city of Care. Rome, for the first time in its young history, stood without a king. But the Romans did not descend into chaos. Instead, They chose to replace monarchy not with anarchy, but with a new form of government, the res publica, the public thing, or republic. Power would now rest with elected officials called consuls, two of whom would be chosen annually to serve together, balancing each other and preventing the rise of another tyrant. They would be advised by the Senate, whose role would only grow in the centuries to come. The Roman people would vote in assemblies, giving a voice, however limited and complex, to broader society. The memory of the kings remained strong, but it became something to be guarded against. Roman culture for centuries afterward would carry a deep suspicion of concentrated power. The very word king, rex, became politically dangerous. Even in times of great crisis, when the Republic appointed a temporary dictator, the title came with strict limits and expectations for swift resignation. And yet, the legacy of the monarchy lived on in many forms. The city itself bore the marks of its regal past: temples, walls, the Cloaca Maxima, the Forum. Religious rituals established by the kings continued unchanged. The symbols of royal power, like the fasces, remained in use by magistrates. Even Rome's military and social organization reflected structures first shaped in the days of Numa and Servius. The fall of the monarchy in 509 BCE, as the traditional date holds, was not the end of Rome's story. It was the beginning of its reinvention. In the soft light of hindsight, it's easy to cast this shift as inevitable. But for those who lived it, it was a profound transformation. They had been subjects. Now they were citizens. Rome, no longer ruled by a single voice, would begin a new experiment, one that would stretch across centuries, across continents, and into history books yet unwritten. The kings were gone. But Rome had only just begun. With the monarchy gone, Rome entered a new era, not of peace or perfection, but of experimentation. The year 509 BCE marked the traditional beginning of the Roman Republic, a system of government that would evolve slowly, layer by layer, through conflict, compromise, and persistence. At first, the changes were structural. Instead of one king, Rome now elected two consuls, chosen annually. These men were granted equal power and expected to consult each other before making major decisions. If one attempted to act alone, the other could veto him. This concept of shared authority was new and central to the Republic's aim: to prevent any single individual from becoming too powerful. The first consuls were Lucius Junius Brutus and Lucius Tarquinius Collatinus. Their names reflected the transition. Brutus, the outspoken voice of revolution; Collatinus, closely tied to the royal family. But even this early phase proved complicated. Collatinus, despite his support for the Republic, was pressured to resign simply because of his royal lineage. In his place, another nobleman was elected, and the message was clear: Rome was not going back. Yet the structure of the Republic was far from democratic in the modern sense. Power remained concentrated in the hands of the patricians, the elite landowning families who claimed noble descent. They held seats in the Senate, an advisory council that, while not formally legislative at first, shaped policy and directed public funds. Senators served for life, and their influence was vast, extending into law, foreign affairs, and religion. Beneath them stood the plebeians, the common people, farmers, laborers, tradesmen. They made up the majority of Rome's population, fought in its armies, paid its taxes, and yet held little formal power. At first, they had no representation, no legal protections, and no say in selecting magistrates. This imbalance led to tension. The early years of the Republic were marked by internal struggle, known as the conflict of the orders. a centuries-long power struggle between patricians and plebeians. It was not always violent, but it was persistent. The plebeians, through protests, strikes, and negotiations, gradually gained concessions. One of the most significant early changes was the creation of the office of the tribune of the plebs. These tribunes, elected exclusively by plebeians, had the power to protect their fellow citizens from unjust treatment by other magistrates. They could also veto laws and actions that threatened the interests of the common people. Their persons were considered sacrosanct. To harm a tribune was not just illegal, it was sacrilege. Another critical moment came with the 12 Tables, Rome's first written code of laws, established around 450 BCE. Until then, laws had been based on custom and were interpreted by patrician judges, often in ways that favored their class. The 12 Tables, carved into wooden or bronze tablets and displayed in the Forum, gave all citizens access to the same legal expectations. They covered a range of topics, from property disputes to family rights to trial procedures, and while far from egalitarian, they were a step toward transparency. Over time, more offices and layers of governance emerged: praetors to oversee civil law, quaestors to manage finances, aediles to supervise public works and markets. The censors, elected every 5 years, counted the population, reviewed the Senate rolls, and enforced public morals. Elections were held in assemblies, but voting was weighted by class and wealth. The wealthier citizens were grouped in smaller voting blocks, meaning their influence far outweighed their numbers. Yet even this imperfect system allowed for some level of public participation and mobility. Rome's military also began to formalize. Consuls led the legions into battle, and military service remained a core expectation of citizenship. Victory brought spoils, and spoils brought opportunity, both for personal advancement and for the expansion of Roman power. Religion, too, remained tightly woven into governance. Augurs interpreted omens before major decisions. Priests maintained rituals that were seen as essential to the city's well-being. Festivals filled the calendar, some sacred, some celebratory, drawing the people together in moments of shared identity. The early republic was still a small city-state surrounded by rivals. It faced threats from neighboring tribes like the Volsci, the Aequi, and the Etruscans. But even under pressure, Rome's new government proved flexible. Leadership changed annually. New voices entered the debate. Power was checked, distributed, and, over time, rebalanced. This system was not born perfect. It was shaped, tested, and improved through challenge. But its foundation was clear. No more kings. Rome had traded royal command for collective rule. And while the path ahead would be long and uneven, the structures put in place during these early Republican years would guide the city for centuries. Quietly, Rome was becoming more than a city. It was becoming an idea. As Rome transitioned from monarchy to republic, it did not do so in isolation. The Italian peninsula in the 5th century BCE was a mosaic of cultures and city-states, each vying for territory, security, and influence. Rome, still young and relatively small, was surrounded by powerful and ancient peoples, the Etruscans to the north, the Latins and Sabines nearby, and the warlike hill tribes of the Apennines to the east. The newly formed Roman Republic quickly found itself drawn into conflict, not because of ambition at first, but out of necessity. Defense of borders, disputes over land, and raids from neighboring peoples became a defining feature of early Republican life. Warfare was not yet about empire, it was about survival. The Etruscans, who had once provided kings to Rome, remained a cultural and military power. Cities like Veii, just 12 miles north of Rome, stood as immediate threats. Veii was wealthy, fortified, and historically hostile. Its influence loomed large across the Tiber River, and tensions between the two cities simmered for decades. Rome's early wars with Veii were drawn out and grueling. Skirmishes flared along trade routes and farming lands. These were not massive battles of legions clashing in open fields. They were border disputes, ambushes, and small-scale raids. Yet they shaped Roman identity. They taught discipline, forged military traditions, and highlighted the need for stronger fortifications and leadership. In time, the conflict with Veii culminated in a remarkable victory. After years of war, including a rare 10-year siege, Rome finally broke through Veii's defences around 396 BCE. According to tradition, the Roman general Marcus Furius Camillus masterminded the final assault by digging tunnels under the city's walls. The fall of Veii marked a turning point. Rome had defeated a major rival and taken its wealth, land, and population. It was a moment of triumph that echoed beyond the battlefield. To the east and southeast, Rome clashed with tribes like the Aequi and Volsci. These highland peoples lived in more scattered tribal societies, often launching raids into Latin lands. Rome's wars with them were constant and exhausting, with some campaigns lasting only weeks, others recurring for decades. One memorable confrontation was the Battle of Mount Algidus, where Roman forces narrowly avoided disaster. Stories from these campaigns often featured legendary Roman heroes, like Lucius Quintius Cincinnatus, the farmer statesman called from his plough to serve as dictator during a time of crisis. He defeated Rome's enemies swiftly, then famously returned to his farm, refusing to hold on to power. His name would become a symbol of civic virtue, a reminder that Rome valued duty over ambition, at least in its ideals. Rome also fought and negotiated with its Latin neighbours. Though sharing language and religious customs, the Latin League, a confederation of towns like Tibur, Praeneste, and Aricia, often found itself both allied with and opposed to Rome. Treaties were made, broken, and remade. The relationship was complex, part kinship, part rivalry. These conflicts served several purposes for early Rome. They kept the military engaged and ready. They provided land and spoils that could be distributed to citizens, encouraging loyalty and expanding Rome's influence. And, crucially, they pushed Rome to refine its political and military systems. The manipal system began to take shape, an early form of battlefield organization that allowed flexibility and responsiveness. Military service remained tied to property and citizenship, reinforcing the idea that defending Rome was not only a duty, but a defining trait of Roman identity. Conquests also brought new people under Roman rule. Instead of simply destroying defeated communities, Rome began offering carefully calibrated terms. Some were granted partial rights, others full citizenship over time. This strategy of incorporation, rewarding loyalty with belonging, would become one of Rome's most effective tools for long-term expansion. And yet, the early republic's victories were often hard-won and precarious. Resources were limited, the city's walls were not impregnable, and there were setbacks to come, none more shocking than what would happen when Rome faced an enemy it had not expected. For in the not-too-distant future, a group of warriors from the north would come sweeping down through Italy, bringing fire, chaos, and a brutal lesson that Rome would never forget. But before that storm, Rome had learned to hold its ground. Not through overwhelming strength, but through resilience, through grit, through a stubborn refusal to be erased. The year was 390 BCE, and Rome stood on the brink of a trauma so profound it would echo in its collective memory for centuries. The city, still relatively small and surrounded by enemies, had begun to assert itself through military victories and slow territorial expansion. But nothing in its brief history had prepared it for what was about to come. The sudden, violent arrival of a people from beyond the mountains, the Gauls. The Gauls, or Signones to be more specific, were a Celtic tribe from northern Italy, part of a broader network of Celtic peoples who had migrated southward from regions across the Alps. They were fierce warriors, known for their bold charges, colourful dress, and alien customs. To the Romans, they were a terrifying unknown, not because of sheer size or numbers, but because they came from beyond the world Rome understood. The encounter began not with Rome, but with a neighbouring city, Clusium, an Etruscan town that had fallen under threat from the advancing Gauls. Clusium appealed to Rome for help. Though it was not a Roman ally by formal treaty, the Roman Senate saw an opportunity to expand influence and sent envoys to negotiate with the Gauls. But the Roman envoys overstepped. Rather than remaining neutral diplomats, they joined in a skirmish, and one of them, according to tradition, killed a Gallic chieftain in battle. Outraged, the Gauls demanded justice. Rome refused, and so the Senones marched south, not in a disorganized raid, but in force with purpose. The Romans mustered their forces and met the Gauls at the Battle of the Allia, a small tributary of the Tiber River just north of the city. What followed was one of Rome's most humiliating defeats. The Roman lines broke quickly. The army scattered. Some fled to the hills, others back toward the city, and many were cut down. It was said that the gods were not properly consulted, that the omens had been ignored, that hubris had blinded the consuls. With no significant resistance left, the Gauls marched unopposed toward Rome. In a matter of days, they reached the city gates. The Romans, in shock, had no time to organize a true defense. Many citizens, especially women, children, and the elderly, fled to the countryside or took refuge in fortified places. The remaining defenders, mostly the Senate, priests, and a few hundred soldiers, gathered on the Capitoline Hill, the symbolic heart of Rome. It was steep and defensible, but everything else was left exposed. The Gauls entered Rome and found it nearly deserted. What followed was a sack, but not one of total destruction. The Gauls looted what they could, set buildings ablaze, and killed any stragglers they found. Fire swept through temples and homes. The streets were choked with smoke and ash. Yet they did not breach the Capitoline. Not immediately. For months the defenders held out, surviving on dwindling food supplies and their determination not to surrender. One of the most enduring legends from this time is the story of the sacred geese of Juno. One night, as the Gauls attempted a stealthy climb up the Capitoline's cliffs, they went unnoticed by guards, but not by the geese, who honked and flapped loudly, waking the defenders. A Roman soldier, Marcus Manlius, sprang into action and repelled the invaders. The hill was saved for a time. Still, the siege dragged on. Disease began to spread among the Gauls in the heat of the Roman summer. The standoff was no longer sustainable. Eventually, negotiations were opened. The Roman leader at the time, a military tribune named Quintus Sulpicius, agreed to pay the Gauls a ransom, 1,000 pounds of gold, to persuade them to leave. Legend tells of a final insult. When the Romans complained that the Gauls were using rigged weights for the payment, the Gallic chieftain Brennus allegedly threw his sword onto the scales and uttered the words, "Vae victis," woe to the vanquished. But the story doesn't end there. Later, Roman writers, uncomfortable with this shameful chapter, inserted a more triumphant ending. They claimed that just as the gold was being weighed, Marcus Furius Camillus, the exiled general who had defeated Veii, returned with an army, drove off the Gauls, and reclaimed the city without the ransom being paid. Whether this dramatic rescue happened is doubtful. The gold was likely handed over. But the tale reflects Rome's desire to recast even its lowest moments in heroic light. What is certain is that the sack of Rome was a searing experience. It exposed the city's vulnerabilities. It shattered the illusion of security. And it left scars, physical and psychological, that would never fully heal. In the years that followed, Rome rebuilt quickly, with new walls, stronger defences, and a new determination to never be caught unprepared again. The Gauls had come and gone, but Rome would remember, and Rome would rise. After the Gauls withdrew from Rome, leaving behind ashes, broken walls, and a rattled population, the city faced one of the most pivotal crossroads in its history. Many Romans, still shaken by the trauma of the sack, questioned whether the city could, or even should, be rebuilt. The wounds were deep, homes destroyed, temples desecrated, morale shaken. The once proud capital of the Latin people now looked like a ruin. Some citizens even considered abandoning Rome entirely. Legend says that a proposal was put forth to relocate the population to Veii, the Etruscan city recently conquered by Rome. It had been spared the destruction, and its infrastructure was intact. The idea found support among the weary. Veii was safe, habitable, and offered a clean start. But it was Marcus Furius Camillus, the same general credited with saving the city, whether before or after the ransom, depending on which version one believes, who stood against the motion. In a speech that later writers recorded with reverence, he reminded the people that Rome was more than bricks and walls. It was identity, history, destiny. Wherever we dwell, he is said to have proclaimed, we shall still be Romans, but only here, on this ground, are we Rome. And so, slowly, they stayed. The rebuilding of Rome began not with grand temples or stone columns, but with necessity. Simple homes were reconstructed, faster, rougher than before. Streets, which had been winding and uneven, were rebuilt without much planning, contributing to the famously chaotic layout of early Rome. The city grew back like a forest after fire, irregular, living, determined. Defensive needs took priority. The construction of the Servian Wall, a massive defensive barrier named for the earlier king Servius Tullius, was accelerated and expanded. Built of large volcanic tufa stones, the wall encircled the city's 7 hills and extended for nearly 11 kilometers. Gates were added to control passage in and out, and towers allowed for increased visibility. It was a declaration to all. Rome would not fall so easily again. But rebuilding wasn't just physical. Rome's political and military strategies also evolved. The sack had shown how vulnerable the city was to sudden threats, and from that moment forward, Rome became more strategic and aggressive in managing its neighbors. Rather than rely on reaction, Rome began to expand its alliances or impose its authority. Many nearby Latin and Etruscan cities were brought under tighter control. Rome forged mutual defense pacts, built colonies in strategic locations, and ensured that vital roads and supply lines remained open and secure. The trauma of the Gallic sack also left a mark on the Roman psyche. It instilled a deep-seated fear of being unprepared and a near-obsessive focus on discipline. In the years that followed, Roman military training became more rigorous. Soldiers were expected not just to fight, but to obey without hesitation. The Roman legion, still developing its distinctive structure, began to move from militia-like forces to professional, disciplined units. There was a shift in mindset too. Romans came to believe and constantly remind themselves that adversity was a forge, not a grave. Stories of the sack were told and retold, not as shame, but as a lesson, as a warning, as fuel. Religious life also regained footing. Temples were rebuilt and old rituals restored. The Temple of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus, damaged in the attack, was reconstructed. The Vestals, keepers of the sacred fire, returned to their duties. The augurs resumed interpreting the will of the gods. It was not just about ritual, it was about stability, continuity, the belief that even after destruction, the sacred order of Rome remained intact. Rome also began a tradition that would define its history, turning defeat into narrative power. Unlike many cultures that buried their failures, Romans enshrined them. The defeat at the Allia and the sack of the city were marked annually with days of mourning. They did not forget. They reminded themselves not to wallow, but to strengthen their resolve. And slowly, the city came back to life. The Forum once again buzzed with trade and politics. Fields were tilled, roads repaired, and new citizens born into a Rome that looked forward with steel in its bones. The city that had nearly vanished into smoke now stood taller than before, because it had endured. The Gauls had given Rome its greatest wound, and in doing so, they had given it one of its greatest gifts, the hunger never to be humiliated again. What began as recovery would soon transform into ambition. Rome would no longer wait to be attacked. It would rise, rebuild, and begin to expand, not in fear, but in certainty that no flame would be allowed to consume her again. Following the sack and the painstaking process of rebuilding, Rome looked outward once again. Its recovery was not just a matter of stone and mortar, but of pride. In the eyes of neighboring peoples, Rome had been humbled, and while some viewed its survival as a sign of resilience, others saw opportunity, a chance to test the weakened city or assert dominance where Roman influence had previously stood. At the heart of this new phase of conflict was the Latin League, a confederation of Latin cities with shared language, customs, and religious practices. For decades, Rome had maintained a delicate relationship with these cities, sometimes as a leader, sometimes as a peer, and occasionally as a rival. The sack by the Gauls had disrupted the balance. Some cities questioned Rome's strength. Others simply sought more autonomy. But Rome, even as it continued to strengthen its defenses and economy, understood one thing clearly. It could not secure its future while its neighbors remained unpredictable. What followed was a series of shifting alliances, betrayals, negotiations, and battles, known collectively as the Latin Wars. The first major confrontation came in the mid-4th century BCE. Rome, now confident again in its armies and institutions, faced resistance from Latin cities like Tibur, Praenesta, and Velitrae. These cities feared Roman dominance, especially as Rome began establishing colonies and military outposts deeper into shared territories. Rome's strategy was both military and diplomatic. Victories on the battlefield were followed by treaties. Conquered or cooperative towns were offered varying degrees of citizenship, a crucial Roman innovation. By granting partial rights, like the civitas sine suffragio, or citizenship without the vote, Rome tied conquered peoples to the state without granting them full political power. In return, these allies were expected to provide soldiers and support during war. It was not equality, but it was effective. The most decisive turning point came in 340 BCE, when a powerful coalition of Latin cities, along with the Campanian city of Capua and others, launched a concerted effort to challenge Roman expansion. This was the Latin War, a conflict that would determine who led central Italy. The Latin allies demanded equal political rights and a shared leadership within the Roman Republic. A bold move, essentially asking to become not just allies, but co-rulers. The Roman Senate refused. The war began. Battles were fought across plains and hills, along rivers and roads. Among the most significant was the Battle of Vesuvius, where Roman forces, led by Publius Decius Mus and Titus Manlius Torquatus, engaged the Latin coalition in a fierce clash. The Roman generals represented two distinct forms of leadership. Decius Mus was known for bold sacrifice, while Manlius was remembered for strict discipline. One story from this war stood out for generations. When the son of Titus Manlius engaged in single combat against a Latin warrior, a noble act by traditional standards, he returned victorious. But Manlius had issued strict orders forbidding such duels. To uphold discipline, he executed his own son. It was a harsh decision, but one that underlined the Roman obsession with order and obedience. The message was clear. In Rome, personal glory never outweighed the state. Rome eventually defeated the Latin coalition, but instead of simply raising its former allies, it absorbed them. Each city was treated differently. Some were granted municipal status, others lost independence but retained local governance. Rome offered protection and opportunity, but only under Roman terms. This outcome reshaped Italy. Where once there had been a network of equal Latin cities, there was now a Roman centre with a web of loyal satellites. The Latin League was dissolved. Rome became the primary force in central Italy, not just through conquest, but through administrative creativity. It didn't just crush its enemies, it made them Roman. The Latin War was more than a military victory. It marked the end of shared rule and the beginning of Roman supremacy in the region. It demonstrated Rome's ability to turn rivals into tools, to convert resistance into growth. It also set a pattern that Rome would repeat again and again: fight a war, offer selective citizenship, plant colonies, and expand the Republic, not through destruction, but through integration. With Latium secured, Rome turned its gaze farther still. To the mountains, to the coasts, to the Samnites and the Greeks. The city was no longer just rebuilding, it was rising. As Rome emerged from its conflicts with the Latin League stronger than ever, it found itself poised for further expansion, not just in influence, but in territory. Central Italy was a patchwork of tribal lands, independent city-states, and mountain strongholds, many of which had long histories of warfare, alliances, and rivalries. Chief among them were the Samnites, a fierce and independent people who occupied the rugged highlands of south-central Italy. The Samnites were not a unified state in the Roman sense, but rather a confederation of warrior tribes. They lived in fortified hill towns, spoke an Oscan dialect, and prided themselves on their martial traditions and autonomy. Their lands, though mountainous, were rich in pasture and minerals, and more importantly, they sat at a crossroads between northern and southern Italy. Any power that wished to control the Italian peninsula would eventually come into contact, and likely conflict, with them. The First Samnite War began around 343 BCE, sparked by events in the Campanian city of Capua. Capua, though wealthy and sophisticated, found itself under threat from Samnite raids. In desperation, it appealed to Rome for protection. Rome, fresh from its success in Latium and eager to expand its southern influence, agreed to help. This decision marked a significant shift. Rome had now positioned itself not only as the protector of its Latin kin, but also as a defender and soon ruler of cities beyond its ethnic or linguistic group. The war began as a defensive action, but quickly grew into a campaign of assertion. The Roman legions, still evolving into their now famous formation of maniples, clashed with the Samnite hill warriors in a series of engagements across rugged terrain. Fighting in the mountains was difficult, not the flat open fields Roman tactics preferred, and the Samnites were skilled at ambush and surprise attacks. Still, Rome achieved victories. Notably, it managed to defend Campania and secure alliances in the region. Yet the war ended somewhat abruptly just 2 years later with a negotiated peace. Rome returned to its earlier borders, and the Samnites retained their independence. The conflict had not yet matured into full-scale rivalry, but that would soon change. The more significant struggle came a few years later with the outbreak of the Second Samnite War in 326 BCE, a conflict that would last over 2 decades and test Rome in ways it had never been tested before. This time, the spark was different. Rome had established a colony at Fregellae. Deep in territory the Samnites considered their own. The Samnites saw this as an intrusion. Rome saw it as a natural expansion. Neither side backed down. The early stages of the war were bitter and difficult. The Samnites, using the terrain to their advantage, scored a humiliating victory at the Battle of the Caudine Forks. In this infamous episode, a Roman army was trapped in a narrow mountain pass and surrounded. With no way out, the Roman commanders were forced to surrender and march their soldiers under a yoke of spears, a ritual of submission that deeply shamed the Romans. The defeat shocked the Republic, but Rome did not dissolve in the face of embarrassment. Instead, it regrouped. The Senate rejected the peace treaty agreed to under duress and prepared for a longer, more committed campaign. Roads were built through previously impassable terrain, supply lines were established, and colonies were planted to secure key regions. The Romans adapted, not just tactically, but institutionally. Over the years, the war raged on with alternating victories and defeats. Towns changed hands. Fortresses were built, besieged, and rebuilt again. What became clear was that this was not a war of raiding or border disputes. It was a contest over who would dominate the heart of Italy. The Second Samnite War ended in 304 BCE with Roman victory. By then, Rome had not only reasserted itself in Campania, but had also carved out influence across the central Apennines. The Samnites, though not fully conquered, were weakened and forced into an uneasy peace. But peace with the Samnites never lasted long. The Third Samnite War would begin less than a decade later, pulling in Etruscans, Umbrians, and even Gauls. Yet even before that final phase, the Second Samnite War had reshaped Rome. It had forced Rome to become a military machine. It had driven innovation in engineering, in logistics, in battlefield coordination. It had shown that Rome could suffer shame and emerge stronger, and it had given Rome something else: access. Access to southern Italy, to new trade routes, to cultural exchange with Greek cities along the coast, to the idea that perhaps Roman power was not just destined for Latium, but for the entire peninsula. The Samnites had fought fiercely, and they would fight again. But Rome, with every hill taken and every road built, was learning how to endure. As Rome emerged from the long and grinding Samnite wars, it was no longer simply a regional power. It had become a central force in Italy, militarily hardened, strategically wise, and increasingly aware of its destiny to unify the peninsula. Yet this growth didn't come solely from victory in battle. Much of Rome's expansion was laid, quite literally, stone by stone, along its roads. One of the defining features of Rome's rise in this period was its unprecedented investment in infrastructure. The most famous and earliest of these was the Via Appia, or Appian Way, constructed beginning in 312 BCE under the direction of Appius Claudius Caecus, a censor with a vision for long-term power projection. The Via Appia began in Rome and extended southeast toward Capua, a critical city in Campania. Over time, it would stretch farther, all the way to Brundisium on the Adriatic coast. But even in its early form, it transformed how Rome operated. These roads were more than just dirt paths. They were carefully engineered, layered with gravel, sand, and tightly fitted stones. They were designed to endure weather and traffic, to drain water efficiently, and to provide direct access for legions, merchants, and messengers alike. With the Via Appia, Rome could send an army across hundreds of kilometers in a matter of days, something few of its rivals could even dream of. Roads enabled Rome to move supplies, information, and authority with speed and reliability. And along these roads, Rome built colonies, small Roman outposts and settlements meant to secure territory, house veterans, and extend Roman law into new regions. These colonies acted like anchors, holding down territory that might otherwise be lost after a military campaign. They became islands of Roman culture, spreading language, customs, architecture, and law. At first, these colonies were often militarized, surrounded by walls, equipped with garrisons. But over time, they evolved into towns and cities that fully integrated into the Roman system. The spread of these settlements served another purpose as well. It bound the conquered peoples to Rome. In many cases, the inhabitants of newly acquired territories were granted partial citizenship or other legal protections. While not always generous, these concessions were significant. They gave locals a stake in the Roman system and slowly turned former enemies into Roman allies, or socii. This process of integration was methodical. Towns were required to contribute soldiers to Rome's armies. Local elites were encouraged to collaborate. Roman officials were stationed in key areas to ensure tax collection, legal consistency, and political oversight. But perhaps most importantly, the people of Italy began to share more than just political ties. They began to share roads, laws, and battles. Culturally, this period saw increased interaction between Rome and the Greek colonies of southern Italy, known collectively as Magna Graecia. Cities like Neapolis, modern Naples, Tarentum, and Syracuse boasted theatres, gymnasiums, temples, and art that reflected a more refined and ancient civilization than Rome's own. Roman soldiers and settlers, exposed to Greek drama, sculpture, and philosophy, brought these influences home. They adopted Greek gods under Roman names, mimicked architecture, and studied new forms of rhetoric and governance. This cultural blend, part Latin, part Etruscan, part Greek, slowly gave shape to what we now think of as classical Roman identity. It was not purely Roman, but something broader, richer, and more layered. Meanwhile, the military machine continued to evolve. Rome began standardizing the legion as the core of its army, organized, disciplined and modular. Unlike the looser tribal formations of its enemies, the legion could adapt quickly, shift tactics, and maintain cohesion even under duress. This made Rome a formidable opponent in both open battle and protracted campaigns. But with every step forward came new resistance. As Rome pushed south, it approached the wealthy and powerful Greek city of Tarentum, which had grown wary of Rome's advance. This tension would soon explode into confrontation, drawing Rome into its first major war with a Hellenistic power, and introducing the Republic to a military challenge unlike anything it had faced before. But even before that clash, Rome had already laid the groundwork, not just in treaties or alliances, but with stones pressed into the earth and roads that reached across mountains and valleys. Rome was no longer just conquering, it was connecting, and connection, the Romans would learn, was sometimes more powerful than conquest. By the early 3rd century BCE, Rome's influence had spread across much of central and southern Italy. Through decades of war, diplomacy, and colonization, the Republic had secured control over a broad and diverse population. But as its territory expanded, so too did the complexity of its alliances and the boldness of its enemies. The most formidable of these, at this stage, was not an Italian tribe or a Latin rebel, but a foreign king, a seasoned general from across the Adriatic Sea named Pyrrhus of Epirus. Epirus, located in what is now northwestern Greece and southern Albania, was a kingdom steeped in Hellenistic culture. Pyrrhus, a distant relative of Alexander the Great, was ambitious, charismatic, and skilled in the art of war. Like many rulers of his time, he dreamed of carving out a legacy to rival Alexander's, and Italy, with its wealthy Greek colonies and growing Roman presence, offered an enticing stage. The spark came from the city of Tarentum, a rich and proud Greek settlement in southern Italy. Tarentum had long kept Rome at arm's length, wary of its expansion. When Rome intervened in a local dispute and sent ships into Tarentine waters, the Tarentines saw it as a provocation. Their fleet attacked the Roman vessels, killing or capturing many. Rome responded with indignation, sending envoys to demand reparation. Tarentum refused and instead called for help. They reached out to Pyrrhus. For Pyrrhus, the invitation was irresistible. Not only would it allow him to project power westward, but it would also position him as the defender of Greek culture against an upstart Latin power. He agreed to come, and came in force. In 280 BCE, Pyrrhus landed in Italy with approximately 25,000 troops, including a cavalry force and something Rome had never faced before: war elephants. These massive beasts, armoured and trumpeting, caused awe and panic in equal measure. Though common in the Eastern Mediterranean, they were a new and terrifying sight to Roman soldiers. The first major battle took place at Heraclea. Pyrrhus deployed traditional Macedonian phalanx tactics, tight lines of spearmen advancing in unison alongside his elephants. The Roman legions fought bravely and held their ground longer than Pyrrhus expected. But in the end, the elephants broke the Roman lines, and the Greeks claimed victory. However, the cost was high. Pyrrhus had won the battle, but lost thousands of his best men. When congratulated on his success, he is said to have remarked, "Another such victory, and I am undone." From this quote, the term Pyrrhic victory was born, a win so costly it threatens the winner's own survival. The war continued. In 279 BCE, Pyrrhus faced the Romans again at the Battle of Asculum. Once more, he won, but again at a steep price. Roman losses were heavy, but Pyrrhus could not replace his experienced troops. His Italian allies were unreliable. And though he sought support from other Greek cities and even the Carthaginians, he found himself increasingly isolated. Frustrated, Pyrrhus accepted an invitation to campaign in Sicily, where Greek cities were fighting against Carthaginian expansion. He left Italy temporarily, hoping to expand his influence there. Though he achieved some victories, he alienated allies with his arrogance and failed to gain a decisive hold. In 275 BCE, Pyrrhus returned to Italy, hoping for one final triumph. At the Battle of Beneventum, he faced Roman forces under Manius Curius Dentatus. This time, the Romans were ready for his tactics. The elephants faltered, the legions held firm, and though the battle was inconclusive, it was enough to convince Pyrrhus to withdraw. He returned to Epirus, disillusioned and weary. Within a few years, he was killed in a skirmish, struck, according to one story, by a tile thrown by an old woman from a rooftop. Pyrrhus left Italy without having achieved his goals, but the impact of his campaign was profound. For the first time, Rome had faced a professional Hellenistic army, led by a renowned general, and survived. The Republic had adapted, endured, and ultimately outlasted a foreign challenge. This elevated Rome's prestige not only in Italy, but across the Mediterranean. Greek cities in southern Italy, seeing the outcome, began to submit to Roman authority. Tarentum, once defiant, surrendered and became a client city. The dream of a Greek-controlled southern Italy faded. Rome, by resisting Pyrrhus, had proved it could not only defend itself, but also assert itself on the international stage. The elephants had thundered, the phalanx had held, but Rome had endured, and in doing so, it had taken one step closer to becoming more than a regional power. It was beginning to look like a Mediterranean power. By the mid-3rd century BCE, Rome had accomplished what would have once seemed impossible. It had brought nearly the entire Italian peninsula under its control. From the Etruscan cities of the north to the Greek colonies of the south, Rome had expanded its reach through a combination of war, diplomacy, colonization, and assimilation. The campaign against Pyrrhus had been the final obstacle. With his withdrawal and the subsequent surrender of Tarentum, there were no major independent powers left in Italy. But Rome's dominance was not merely military. What truly set the Republic apart was its method of incorporation. Unlike empires that simply ruled over conquered peoples, Rome offered degrees of participation. Through systems of citizenship, alliances, and integration, Rome created a network that bound the peninsula together, not just by force, but by shared interest. After each conquest, Rome carefully evaluated the defeated region. In many cases, it offered partial citizenship, legal protections without voting rights. These allies, or socii, were expected to contribute troops to Rome's armies, pay taxes, and maintain loyalty. In return, they received security, access to Roman markets, and the long-term possibility of full citizenship. Rome also founded colonies in strategic locations, fortified settlements of Roman citizens and Latin allies. These colonies served as military outposts, cultural bridges, and economic hubs. They spread Roman law, language, and architecture across the peninsula. Colonies like Venusia, Luceria, and Narnia helped secure Rome's frontiers and cement its presence in regions that had once resisted its authority. The Roman road system continued to expand. New roads such as the Via Valeria, Via Latina, and Via Flaminia linked cities and colonies to the capital, ensuring fast movement of troops, goods, and messages. The roads were feats of engineering, built straight and solid, often with milestones marking the distance from Rome. a subtle but powerful reminder of who held power. By 264 BCE, Rome's influence extended from the Apennine Mountains to the coasts of the Tyrrhenian and Adriatic seas. The Etruscans had been subdued, the Samnites broken, the Latin League dissolved, and the Greek cities pacified. While some regions still maintained local customs and languages, they now existed within the framework of Roman rule. Yet for all its success, Rome's position was not entirely secure. The Italian allies, while bound to Rome, remained distinct and unequal. Resentment simmered, and though they did not yet erupt, they would one day become fuel for civil unrest. But for now, the system held. Rome had also become a military powerhouse. Its citizen army had grown in size and professionalism. Officers were elected by the people but trained with increasing consistency. The manipular formation, flexible and responsive, allowed the legions to adapt to diverse terrain and tactics, a significant advantage over traditional phalanx-based armies. With Italy secured, Rome now had resources it had never possessed before. Mines, farmland, ports and manpower all could now be directed toward larger ambitions. Trade flowed more freely, markets grew, wealth accumulated, and with that, wealth came opportunity and the attention of powerful rivals. To the west, across the sea, lay Carthage, a mighty city-state in North Africa with its own empire, navy, and commercial reach. Carthage controlled parts of Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica, and its influence extended deep into the western Mediterranean. For years, Rome and Carthage had coexisted, even signed treaties. But as Rome's reach stretched south, it approached the edges of Carthaginian power. The two great republics, one rising, one established, were on a collision course. The next chapter of Rome's story would not be about Italy, but about empire. Rome had proven itself the master of the land. Soon, it would test its strength at sea, and the struggle that awaited would be unlike anything Rome had ever faced. A war not for survival, but for dominance of the known world. With the Italian peninsula firmly under its control, Rome's ambitions and anxieties turned outward, toward the sea. For centuries, Rome had been a land-based power, cautious and deliberate in its expansion. But to the south and west lay the island of Sicily, a rich and strategically vital territory that had long been the battleground of rival powers. It was here that Rome would first clash with a city-state of equal, if not greater, power, Carthage. Carthage, located in modern-day Tunisia, had been founded by Phoenician settlers centuries earlier and had grown into a maritime empire. Its wealth came from trade, in metals, grain, slaves, textiles, and from its dominance over key islands and coastal ports across the western Mediterranean. It maintained a powerful navy, a professional mercenary army, and vast political reach. The island of Sicily, positioned like a stepping stone between Italy and Africa, was an obvious point of tension. While parts of the island were controlled by Greek city-states, others were in the hands of Carthage. Rome had no presence there, yet. But that was about to change. In 264 BCE, a small conflict in the Sicilian city of Messana triggered a chain of events that would draw both powers into a war neither had originally planned. Messana had been seized by a group of Italian mercenaries known as the Mamertines, who, once in control, found themselves threatened by the nearby Greek city of Syracuse. In desperation, the Mamertines sought help, first from Carthage, then from Rome. Both responded, but the presence of two competing powers in one small city quickly escalated into broader hostilities. Rome, perhaps reluctantly at first, agreed to protect the Mamertines and expelled the Carthaginian garrison from Messana. To Carthage, this was an act of aggression. Diplomatic protests were made, ignored, and then came the formal declaration of war. Thus began the First Punic War, a conflict that would last 23 years, the longest continuous war in Roman history up to that point. Rome entered the war at a disadvantage. It had no navy to speak of. Carthage, by contrast, was a maritime superpower with fleets that had patrolled the Mediterranean for generations. But Rome, never one to accept its limitations, began building a fleet from scratch. Using a captured Carthaginian ship as a model, Roman engineers constructed hundreds of warships and added a new feature, the corvus, a boarding ramp that allowed Roman infantry to turn sea battles into land battles by locking ships together and storming across. It was an innovation born of necessity, and it worked. In the first major naval victory at Mylae, Rome shocked Carthage by defeating its fleet. Other battles followed, some wins, some losses. The sea proved as unpredictable as any battlefield. Storms destroyed entire fleets. Disease spread quickly in cramped ships, yet Rome persisted. Meanwhile, on land, Rome campaigned in Sicily. The island became a grinding battleground of fortified towns, mountainous passes, and shifting alliances. Cities changed hands multiple times. The war was not one of sweeping conquests, but of attrition, sieges, supply lines, and endurance. In 256 BCE, Rome attempted to take the war directly to Carthage by invading North Africa. For a time, it succeeded. A Roman army led by Marcus Atilius Regulus landed near Carthage and won several battles. But the tide turned when Carthage hired a brilliant Spartan general, Xanthippus, who reorganized their forces and crushed the Romans in a pitched battle. Regulus was captured and the Roman army decimated. The war dragged on. Both sides suffered staggering losses. Fleets were lost to storms and battle. Cities starved under siege. Yet neither Rome nor Carthage could afford to give in. Finally, in 241 BCE, after 2 decades of exhausting warfare, the decisive moment came at the Battle of the Aegates Islands. Rome, having rebuilt yet another fleet, surprised the Carthaginian navy off the western coast of Sicily. With superior maneuvering and aggressive boarding tactics, the Romans won a crushing victory. Carthage, facing internal unrest and financial exhaustion, sued for peace. Under the terms of the Treaty of Lutatius, Carthage surrendered Sicily, its most prized western possession, to Rome. It also paid a heavy indemnity. For the first time in its history, Rome had acquired territory outside the Italian peninsula. The war had changed Rome. It had become a naval power. It had developed new systems of taxation and grain distribution to support distant campaigns. It had learned to operate far from home and to hold what it conquered. But perhaps most importantly, it had tasted empire. And that taste would not fade. With the signing of the peace treaty in 241 BCE and the formal acquisition of Sicily, Rome found itself in an unfamiliar position. It was now the ruler of a land beyond the Italian peninsula. This victory marked more than the end of a long and brutal war. It signaled the beginning of a new chapter in Roman history. No longer simply a republic of Italian towns and allies, Rome had become an imperial power, even if it didn't yet call itself one. Sicily, with its fertile plains, abundant grain, and strategic location between Europe and Africa, was a valuable prize. For centuries, it had been a mosaic of Greek city-states, native Sicilian tribes, and Carthaginian strongholds. Now, it would be Rome's first province, This introduced challenges the Republic had never faced. Until now, Rome's conquests had taken place within Italy, where defeated peoples could be offered partial citizenship, drawn into alliances, or absorbed into Rome's political structure. But Sicily was different, too distant, too diverse, and too complex to be managed by traditional means. And so Rome improvised. Rather than granting citizenship, Rome established direct control. A praetor, or provincial governor, was appointed by the Senate to oversee the island. His duties included collecting taxes, maintaining order, judging legal disputes, and overseeing military garrisons. The authority of this praetor was broad. He effectively acted as both governor and general, accountable only to the Senate. For the first time, Rome began collecting tribute from a foreign land. Sicilian cities were required to pay taxes, supply grain, and obey Roman law. Some cities that had sided with Rome during the war received more favorable terms, maintaining limited autonomy, while those that had resisted, particularly Carthaginian allies, were subjected to harsher treatment. This arrangement was not meant to be permanent. The Romans viewed it as a practical solution to a temporary situation, but the system they developed in Sicily would soon become a model, repeated across future provinces in Spain, Gaul, North Africa, and beyond. To manage this new relationship, Rome began keeping records, issuing edicts, and creating legal precedents for provincial governance. The idea of Roman law applying beyond Rome, across the sea, in lands populated by people who spoke different languages and lived by different customs, was revolutionary. It was a slow, uneven process, but the foundation had been laid. Economically, the acquisition of Sicily had a major impact. The island became Rome's breadbasket, supplying grain that would feed the growing population of the capital. This dependence on foreign grain would only deepen in the centuries to come, shaping Roman policy, trade, and even politics. Meanwhile, the end of the First Punic War did not bring peace in the broader Mediterranean. In the wake of Carthage's defeat, several of its mercenary armies, unpaid and angry, revolted in what became known as the Mercenary War. Rome watched carefully as Carthage struggled to contain the rebellion. Taking advantage of the chaos, Rome seized control of the islands of Sardinia and Corsica, claiming that Carthage had violated the peace treaty. Carthage protested, but its hands were tied. Weak from war and internal strife, it had no choice but to accept. The seizure of these islands deepened the bitterness between the two powers. Though peace remained officially in place, the seeds of future conflict had been sown. To the average Roman, these developments were both exciting and unfamiliar. For centuries, Rome had been focused inward, managing domestic affairs, Italian allies, and nearby enemies. Now suddenly, it found itself responsible for distant islands, foreign populations, and overseas garrisons. It was exhilarating. It was profitable. But it also raised questions about who Rome was becoming. Was the Republic still a citizen state, grounded in shared values and cooperation? Or was it slowly transforming into something larger and perhaps more dangerous? The conquest of Sicily forced Romans to think in new ways. Diplomacy now included Greek cities and African kingdoms. Armies had to travel by sea. Decisions made in the Senate affected people who had never seen the Tiber River or heard Latin spoken aloud. Rome was no longer just an Italian city-state. It was something more. And as the dust settled over Sicily's fields and the grain ships began sailing north, Rome's leaders could sense what lay ahead. This was not the end of expansion. It was the beginning. In the wake of the First Punic War, Carthage, though defeated, was far from broken. the city remained wealthy, resilient, and fiercely proud. Its leaders rebuilt swiftly, expanding influence into new territories, especially in the Iberian Peninsula, modern-day Spain, where Carthaginian generals saw fresh opportunity to regain what had been lost. Among these generals was Hamilcar Barca, a name that would soon become known across the Roman world. Hamilcar had fought in the later stages of the First Punic War and had bitterly opposed the peace treaty that ended it. He believed Rome had cheated Carthage out of victory, first by capturing Sicily, then by seizing Sardinia and Corsica during the Mercenary War. For him, peace was merely a pause. To restore Carthage's power and pride, Hamilcar turned west. He led his forces into Iberia, a land rich in silver, warriors, and resources. Over the next decade, Carthage built a new empire there, founding cities, securing mines, and raising an army composed of Iberian, African, and Carthaginian troops. Among these cities was Carthago Nova, New Carthage, which became the heart of Carthaginian Spain. At Hamilcar's side was his son, a boy who would come to embody Carthage's fury and ambition. Hannibal. According to later Roman writers, when Hannibal was just 9 years old, his father brought him to an altar and made him swear a solemn oath that he would never be a friend to Rome. Whether this story is literal truth or symbolic memory, it captures what Hannibal represented: a legacy of resistance, a generational vow to challenge the rising power across the sea. After Hamilcar's death, command in Iberia passed to his son-in-law, Hasdrubal the Fair, and then, in time, to Hannibal himself. By the year 221 BCE, Hannibal was in full control of Carthage's forces in Spain. Charismatic, fearless, and brilliant, he quickly won the loyalty of his troops and the admiration of his enemies. But the peace between Rome and Carthage was growing thin. Rome had watched Carthage's expansion into Iberia with increasing concern. Though the treaty ending the First Punic War had not explicitly forbidden Carthaginian activity in Spain, Rome feared a new rival rising just across the sea. To contain this, Rome forged an alliance with the city of Saguntum, located south of the Ebro River, the unofficial boundary line of Carthaginian influence. To Carthage, this alliance was a clear provocation. Saguntum was in their sphere. Rome had no business interfering. In 219 BCE, Hannibal acted. He laid siege to Saguntum, capturing the city after months of brutal fighting. The Roman Senate, furious at this breach, demanded Carthage hand over Hannibal for punishment. Carthage refused. War was declared. So began the Second Punic War, one of the most famous and devastating conflicts in ancient history. Hannibal, knowing that a direct attack on Rome by sea would be impossible, chose a different path, a bold, almost unthinkable one. He would march his army overland from Spain through Gaul and across the Alps into Italy. It was a journey filled with hardship, cold, hunger, treacherous mountain passes, and attacks by hostile tribes. Yet Hannibal pressed on. He brought with him tens of thousands of troops, including war elephants, symbols of Eastern power that terrified Roman observers. In 218 BCE, Hannibal descended into northern Italy. His army was battered, but alive. The Romans, unprepared for such a move, rushed to respond. But it was too late. Hannibal was in their homeland, and he would not leave for nearly 15 years. What followed would be some of the darkest years in Rome's history. Victories at Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and most devastatingly at Cannae, where tens of thousands of Roman soldiers were killed, would shake the Republic to its core. Cities in southern Italy defected to Hannibal's cause. Fear gripped the capital, but all of that still lay ahead. For now, the boy who had sworn hatred against Rome had kept his promise. He had crossed mountains, defied expectations, declared war not only on Rome's armies, but on its pride. Rome had risen through discipline, resilience, and adaptation. Now it would be tested in a way it never had before, not by chaos, but by genius, and Hannibal was just getting started. As Hannibal roamed the Italian countryside, defeating Roman armies and gathering support from discontented allies, the Republic stood on the edge of collapse. Never before had Rome faced an enemy so daring, so skilled, and so relentless. After the catastrophic defeat at Cannae in 216 BCE, where over 50,000 Roman soldiers were killed in a single day, panic gripped the city. The Senate, once confident and measured, found itself confronting the very real possibility that Rome might fall. But Rome did not fall. The Republic's strength had never come solely from its legions, but from its institutions, its stubborn citizenry, and its remarkable ability to adapt in crisis. In the face of disaster, the Senate appointed Quintus Fabius Maximus as dictator. Fabius introduced a new strategy, one that would be mocked at first, but ultimately prove effective. Rather than face Hannibal directly in battle, Fabius chose a policy of delay, avoiding confrontation, harassing enemy supply lines, and denying Hannibal easy victories. This earned him the nickname Cunctator, the delayer. Though unpopular among the people and criticized by impatient generals, Fabius understood something crucial. Hannibal's strength lay in battle, so Rome would deny him battle. Meanwhile, the Senate raised new armies, recruited younger soldiers, and rebuilt its alliances. Despite the temptation, Rome refused to negotiate, even as Hannibal marched across Italy. Even as cities like Capua and Tarentum defected to his side, Rome held firm. This discipline extended even to the sacred. In a symbolic gesture of faith and sacrifice, 2 Greek priests were buried alive beneath the Forum, following ancient rites to appease the gods. A rare and desperate act, signaling just how grave the situation had become. But Hannibal, for all his brilliance, could not break Rome's will. He lacked reinforcements from Carthage, whose government was more cautious than ambitious. He hoped that by staying in Italy long enough, Rome would crack from within. Yet the city endured, even thrived. The longer he stayed, the less support he could gather. Many Italian allies, though resentful of Rome, feared Hannibal more or distrusted his foreign troops. The siege of Rome never came. In time, a new generation of Roman leaders rose from the ashes of defeat. Chief among them was Publius Cornelius Scipio, the son of a fallen general. Brilliant, charismatic, and daring, Scipio earned fame in Spain, where he defeated Carthaginian forces and severed Hannibal's line of supply. His victories in Iberia not only reclaimed valuable territory for Rome, but also elevated him in the eyes of the Senate and people. By 204 BCE, Scipio proposed something bold: take the war to Carthage. The Senate hesitated, wary of leaving Italy while Hannibal still remained, but Scipio's track record and confidence won them over. With an army raised through a mix of state support and private funding, Scipio crossed into Africa. There, he allied with Numidian leaders, including Massinissa, whose cavalry would prove decisive. Carthage, now under threat at home, had no choice but to recall Hannibal from Italy. After nearly 15 years, the legendary general left the land he had ravaged, returning to Africa for a final confrontation. In 202 BCE, the 2 great commanders met at Zama. The battle was fierce, but Scipio had prepared well. He had studied Hannibal's tactics, neutralized the elephants, and used his cavalry to encircle the Carthaginian lines, a poetic reversal of Cannae. Hannibal's army, though experienced, was outmatched and outmaneuvered. Rome had triumphed. The Second Punic War ended with Carthage's defeat and a harsh peace treaty. Carthage lost its overseas possessions, its war fleet, and its independence in foreign affairs. Rome imposed a crushing indemnity and ensured that Carthage would never again rise as a military threat. Scipio was hailed as a hero and given the title Africanus. Rome, though battered, stood taller than ever before. It had faced its greatest enemy, lost tens of thousands of soldiers, seen allies defect and lands devastated, and yet it endured. This victory did more than end a war. It established Rome as the undisputed power of the Western Mediterranean. Its legions were now battle-hardened, its commanders experienced, its navy vast, and its people unified by a shared memory of near destruction. From this point forward, Rome no longer fought for survival, it fought for supremacy. The end of the Second Punic War marked a turning point, not just in Roman foreign policy, but in the very identity of the Republic. What had begun as a city-state clinging to the banks of the Tiber was now the commanding power of the Western Mediterranean. With Carthage humbled and Hannibal in exile, Rome stood unmatched. But it was no longer the same Rome that had risen from the ashes of the Gallic sack or fought the Samnites in the Apennine hills. The war had changed everything. Rome's army, once composed mostly of citizen farmers who returned home after each campaign, had become a permanent, professional force. Campaigns now lasted years, fought in distant lands where returning home was not always guaranteed. Generals grew famous, powerful, and politically influential, blurring the lines between military service and civic life. Soldiers now followed commanders with personal loyalty, not just patriotic duty. New provinces, Spain, Sicily, Sardinia, were brought under Roman rule. These were not simply military outposts. They required administration, governors, taxation, and infrastructure. Roman law had to be applied, disputes settled, revolts prevented. Slowly, the Republic became an empire in all but name. Trade flourished across the Mediterranean. Roman merchants established themselves in ports from Gaul to Egypt. Carthage's shipping lanes became Roman routes. Silver from Spain, grain from Sicily, and luxury goods from the east flowed into Italy. With wealth came growth and inequality. The old Roman values of modesty, discipline, and service to the state were challenged by the influx of foreign riches and ideas. Large estates, known as latifundia, replaced small farms, often worked by thousands of slaves captured during war. Meanwhile, many veterans returned home to find their lands neglected or sold, and their voices drowned out in a Senate dominated by elites. Yet the institutions of the Republic, consuls, tribunes, the Senate, remained intact. They adapted slowly, often reluctantly, to the demands of a growing empire. New offices were created to manage provinces. Military triumphs became grand spectacles in Rome, with victorious generals parading through the city to the cheers of the people and the wary eyes of their peers. The memory of Hannibal and the wars he brought lingered. For decades, Roman children were told stories of the man who crossed the Alps with elephants. Senators warned against complacency. One of them, Cato the Elder, famously ended every speech with the words, "Carthago delenda est." Carthage must be destroyed. Though peace held for a time, the seed of another war had been planted. Rome was no longer defensive, but proactive. No longer content with securing its borders, it began reshaping the world beyond them. Greece, Macedonia, and the Hellenistic kingdoms of the East would soon fall under Roman influence or control. The Republic, forged in fields and hills, had now become the master of seas and cities. And yet, amid all this transformation, one thing remained constant. Rome endured, from its mythic founding by Romulus to the sack by the Gauls, from the bloodied fields of Cannae to the triumph at Zama. Through plague, betrayal, victory, and loss, Rome had moved forward, not always gracefully, not always justly, but always determined. Its streets had widened, its walls had stretched, its people had multiplied, but its heart, the stubborn belief that Rome was destined for greatness, beat on. And as the sun set on the 3rd century BCE, casting long shadows across the Forum and lighting the sails of ships departing for Spain and Greece, Rome was only beginning its next story. A story of emperors, revolutions, poets, builders, and dreamers. A story written in stone, in steel, and in sleep.